There are a ton of great action-adventure games out there that each create their own styles of combat and mold you as a player to fit those styles in order to succeed. But after playing through a bunch of Souls-likes last year, I can't stop thinking about one moment from my first playthrough of Sekiro Shadows Die Twice, almost 4 years ago. Sekiro is a game that forces its players to adapt to its uniquely parry-heavy mechanics in order to make any real progress through the game. The game's dodges are occasionally useful, but almost every attack is intended to be deflected at close range, and often dodging away from one attack just puts you in a worse position to get hit by the next one. Add in that Sekiro doesn't provide the player with any summons or the ability to power level their stats by beating up on weaker enemies, and you often have few choices but to learn how to parry everything in your path in order to progress. However, early into the game, Sekiro introduces a mix-up in the form of thrust attacks. Until you encounter the spear-wielding shinobi hunter, every opponent in the game mostly attacks in wide, sweeping arcs that are easy to parry. But the shinobi hunter's stabs slip straight through your attempts at deflection. If you time your blocks perfectly, then it's possible to parry his stabs, but it's far easier to use a new skill called the Mikiri counter, which will fail to block a normal attack, but defends against thrust attacks and offers you a huge reward for reacting correctly to the red unblockable symbol that you see before any stab attack. I spent maybe an hour or two trying to cheese this fight against the shinobi hunter without learning how to use the Mikiri counter, and I got rocked over and over before I finally learned how to use it correctly and beat him pretty easily on the first try, because his most deadly attacks are now my biggest opportunities for big damage thanks to the Mikiri counter. The Shinobi Hunter isn't meant to be an especially difficult boss. He really exists to teach you about the value of stabbing through an opponent's guard, and the huge reward associated with pulling off a Mikiri counter. But that all-powerful counterplay seems like it's locked behind your character's unique shinobi training. Throughout the game, a ton of enemies will try to use stab attacks, and I became very consistent at using the Mikiri counter to defend myself and take them down. But when the roles were reversed, not a single enemy could consistently avoid my own stabs, and if they did, it was just by blocking the attack with perfect timing, which doesn't put me at any real risk. And upon realizing that those enemies don't know how to perform the Mikiri counter, I started to abuse that pretty hard. My new game plan was just to parry attacks and build up their posture meter, and only ever attack if I had the time to charge up a thrust that they would either get hit by or block and reset to a neutral position. And for the next 10 or so hours, I was happily spamming stab attacks to get through like a solid third of the game. I would occasionally switch it up by throwing shurikens to harass people from a distance, or use fireworks to disrupt their offense and buy myself time to heal or charge up another attack, but the bulk of my strategy was really geared around this unblockable stab attack. And then, I got to this guy. Without spoiling too much of the story here, this is Owl. He's introduced as the player character's adoptive father and shinobi mentor, and while the game's story can play out in a bunch of different ways, my first playthrough involved crossing blades with Owl. The fight began with Owl rushing me down, and after blocking a few attacks, I saw my opening and wound up to stab him, just like I've been doing for every other boss. And I absolutely ate shit for it. For the first time in the entire game, I just got hit by the same Mikiri counter that I've been bodying enemies with, and it killed me despite being at nearly full health. The first time this happened, I was actually so stunned I didn't even bother resurrecting for another try. I just sat there dying while Owl taunted me. I ran it back with the same strategy a few more times, in case that was a fluke. And no matter how well I thought I timed my stabs, Owl was ready to Mikiri counter them every single time. And then it clicked. Of course Owl, of all people, the one who's taught Sekiro everything he knows, would be able to perform the technique that he presumably also taught my character. So now, for the first time, I'm not facing down some random samurai or ninja who might have tools of their own that I need to watch out for, but I'm up against a stronger version of myself, someone whose tools and fighting style resemble nothing so much as a superior version of everything my character is at this point in the game. And the Mikiri counter isn't the only similarity between Owl and Sekiro. Just like I've been spamming shurikens when my opponents are far away to prevent them having any time to breathe, as soon as I try to disengage and find room to heal myself, Owl is right there with a handful of shurikens. If I get impatient for even a moment while near Owl, it's all too easy to eat a handful of fireworks while he charges up a powerful attack, the same strategy I've been using against bosses until this point. Owl brings other tools to bear too, from grenades that prevent you from healing yourself, to poison that covers the floor and eats away at your health, and it all comes together to create a boss fight that's not just challenging, but that feels handcrafted to counter Sekiro, because Owl knows your fighting style inside and out. For the first time, hours and hours into this game, you find yourself forced to confront every obnoxious strategy that you've been using until this point, and figure out the counterplay to your own moves. This isn't the only time that Sekiro forces you to confront a number of your own techniques. Most notably, one of the game's final bosses uses a ton of your own moves against you. But that first time that I got Mikiri countered by Owl has stuck with me for years. The game taught me this seemingly broken technique. It gave me hours and hours to feel confident that I was the only one who could use it as I stabbed my way through boss after boss. And then it introduced an enemy who both mechanically and thematically flipped the entire power dynamic on its head. In order to beat Owl, I had to develop strategies to beat a lot of my own moves, and in the process, I started to see the flaws in most of Sekiro's attacks. By the time I was done fighting Owl, I had stopped using things like stab attacks, shurikens, and fireworks entirely because if I could punish those things, then maybe he could too. From that fight on, I leaned into a much cleaner and more defensive style that avoided any gimmicks I thought a future boss could potentially exploit, in the same way that Owl had taken advantage of me spamming stab attacks. The concept of fighting yourself isn't really all that unique to Sekiro. Elden Ring features an optional fight against a mimic that copies your abilities and equipment, and Thymesia's final boss is basically just a clone of yourself. But even those fights felt like poor imitations of your own character's power. At the end of the day, if a computer and a player have the same stats and the same tools, a competent player should usually come out on top. But Owl isn't just copying you. He's a stronger, faster, and more versatile Sekiro who forces you to fight on his terms the entire time. Ever since that first fight against Owl, I've approached this entire genre of game differently. When I get new upgrades, I'm still super excited to test them out and see how they can be applied, but now I'm also thinking about how I would counter those tools if they're ever used against me. Most of the time it never happens, but that possibility is always in the back of my mind, and it adds a new level of complexity to every game I've played since Sekiro. I think that I would still kind of be thinking this way had I encountered a similar gimmick where you fight yourself in another game before I played Sekiro, but to a much lesser extent. Because the decision by FromSoft to let you build up this confidence about how powerful your character is, and how nobody else can use these techniques for nearly half the game, before letting you get obliterated by your former mentor, made the Owl fight a way more memorable experience than just fighting a clone of yourself. This fight isn't just a cool combat, it's actively changing, or at least actively changed my perception of Sekiro's world, and how I interact with it. Because even after defeating Owl, I now know that there's a rare but very real possibility of encountering other shinobi who know Sekiro so well that they have naturally become the perfect enemy to defeat him, and so every gameplay decision from that point on is made with that in mind. Sekiro Shadows Die Twice is generally one of my favorite games, but this fight, and specifically the first time that I got Mikiri countered, has been stuck in my head for years. If you haven't played the game yet, I hope you consider doing so. There's a reason I keep coming back to it, years after my first playthrough.